to fix an immigration system seen by many as broken or at least at its limits.
Did you know that the United States takes in more immigrants than the next 4 countries combined? After the US, the countries that take in the most immigrants are Germany, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the UK. There are over 50 million immigrants in the US, with some being here legally and others not. It is estimated that over 11 million people are in the US illegally, with 48% being from Mexico. There are many ways to be here illegally. Some cross the southern border, while others fly here legally, then overstay their visa. People make the perilous journey to realize the American dream for a plethora of reasons. Some are facing national and economic collapse, like in the case of Venezuela, while others are fleeing civil war, like in the case of Syria and El Salvador. If you turn on the news or log onto social media, you will see that immigration has become a hot-button issue, and frankly, it always has been since the days of Ellis Island. This list will look at the 10 states with the highest percentage of unauthorized persons. This demographic has shifted over the years and is shifting even more as busloads of migrants are being sent to sanctuary cities up north. Stay tuned to the end to see the states with the lowest population of undocumented immigrants. And that brings us to number 10, Illinois. This one may seem shocking since it's not a border state, nor does it have the draw of New York City. However, Chicago specifically, and its status as a sanctuary city, has drawn millions of people to the city despite its depleting resources and harsh winters. With an estimated 500,000 undocumented immigrants, that accounts for 4.15% of its population. While immigrants have found their way through Illinois, Chicago has become ground zero for the migrant crisis. As bus after bus arrives from Texas, Chicagoans are having to accept the consequences of being a sanctuary city. A sanctuary city is a city whose municipal laws tend to protect undocumented immigrants from deportation or prosecution, despite federal immigration law. That means that even if caught or charged with a crime, the city will not resort to deportation. In fact, you are entitled to public counsel and due process as if you were here legally. So it's no wonder that so many flock to the Windy City. Unfortunately, this crisis has created strife between migrants and Chicago natives who feel that the government is putting all of its resources into helping illegal immigrants rather than into the failing schools and crumbling infrastructure. Number 9 is New Mexico, where an estimated 4.32% of its population is undocumented. New Mexico has a much different history than Illinois. New Mexico was once part of the Spanish Empire, then part of Mexico, and finally ceded to the US after the Mexican-American War. Many of the state's Hispanic population aren't immigrants at all. New Mexico shares 179 miles of border with Mexico, which pales in comparison to Texas's 1,200 miles of border. Despite sharing a border with Mexico, the state doesn't have the same volume of border crossings because its geography is less conducive. Cliffs, ravines, and sweltering desert all provide a natural barrier to entry, but that doesn't mean migrants haven't made their way into the state. New Mexico is a relatively easy state to transition to if you are coming from Mexico, Central, or South America because the language and culture within the state are similar. New Mexico is also home to thousands of DACA recipients. DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, a program for children who were brought here illegally by their parents, and helps them to stay without fear of deportation. Many of these DACA recipients were brought here at such a young age that they feel no connection to their home country, and in some cases, they don't even speak the language anymore. Number 8 is Florida. With a population of 21.5 million, an estimated 4.52% of its population is comprised of undocumented immigrants. Florida has long since been a refuge for Cuban immigrants fleeing the Castro regime. The U.S. Coast Guard patrols the waters, and in 2023, they had been catching approximately 43 people per day, up from 17 per day in the previous year. In 1966, the Cuban Adjustment Act was a law that allowed any Cuban who made it into U.S. territorial waters to stay in the U.S. and pursue residency a year later. The law was revised in 1995, and the U.S. government stopped admitting people en route. The new wet foot, dry foot policy said that if a Cuban was caught in the water, or wet foot, then they would be returned to Cuba, whereas any Cuban that made it on land in Florida, or dry foot, would be allowed to stay. One of the most famous cases occurred on Thanksgiving of 1999 when 5-year-old Elian Gonzalez was found clinging to an inner tube just 3 miles off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. The Coast Guard rescued him, but his mother and 11 others on the raft had drowned in their attempt to come to the US from Cuba. This launched one of the most notorious international custody cases, as his father in Cuba fought to have his son returned, while the boy's relatives in Miami wanted him to stay in the US. The events sparked political debate among Americans, many of whom wanted him to stay for political reasons despite his father's pleas. Ultimately, Gonzalez was returned to Cuba, and Florida secures its spot on this list. Number 7 is Maryland. Though this state may come as an initial surprise, its proximity to the nation's capital makes sense. Although the state is relatively small, it is still home to over 6 million people, with an estimated 4.52% being undocumented immigrants. Many come to Maryland to seek work, but also take advantage of the resources of bigger cities like Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The majority of these undocumented immigrants are here from El Salvador. The Salvadoran Civil War raged on from 1979 until 1992. Many people fled to avoid being drafted into the war, particularly children. Over 80% of the government's troops and over 20% of the Farabundo Martí Front for National Liberation, or FMLNs, were under 18 years of age. This was essentially a civil war fought by children, which caused a mass exodus to anyone who could escape. About 67,000 of them ended up in Maryland. Of all the undocumented immigrants in Maryland, 26% of them have been here for less than 5 years. Number 6 is New York, which is surprising that it is not lower down on this list. New York is home to over 19 million people, with an estimated 4.87% being undocumented. That's over a million people. In fact, there are more undocumented immigrants living in New York than there are of the entire population of South Dakota, North Dakota, Alaska, Vermont, or Wyoming, all of which have populations below a million people. New York is a melting pot of culture, art, food, and language. Because New York is not a border state, its undocumented population spans far beyond Mexico and Central America. While 27% of the undocumented immigrants are of Mexican or Central American descent, 23% are from South Asia and East Asia. Another 6% are from Europe, and 4% are from Africa. This gives New York the greatest amount of diversity when it comes to those who seek refuge in the Northeast. And it's not just New York City. Buffalo and Rochester also have a population of undocumented migrants. While many see this as a drain on state resources, many New Yorkers take pride in their multicultural state. Number 5 is Arizona, with just over 7 million people, 4.99% of its population being undocumented migrants. Arizona shares a border with Mexico spanning over 370 miles. Like other states in the Southwest, Arizona was once part of Mexico, so it's no surprise that people from Mexico would cross into Arizona, where they can share a culture and language with those on the US side of the border. With an arbitrary line separating people of the same ethnicity, Arizona and Mexico share just about everything except a passport. A whopping 80% of all undocumented immigrants in Arizona come from Mexico, and this has greatly enriched the state's landscape. Some of the best and most authentic Mexican food can be found in Arizona, and the art and architecture reflects the blend of indigenous, Spanish, and now Mexican cultures. Number 4 is New Jersey, which is also the #1 most densely populated state. Around 6.26% of its population is made up of undocumented immigrants. New Jersey is particularly accommodating to unauthorized immigrants. They enjoy some of the same rights as US citizens, such as minimum wage benefits. Given the state's proximity to New York, many immigrants can share the benefits of being so close to such a big city. Job prospects in New York draw millions, but housing is more available in New Jersey. Many people choose the state for its immigrant-friendly policies. Though not near an international border, New Jersey does see a lot of people who fly in and overstay their visa. In New Jersey, 19% are from Mexico, but 12% are from India. Sadly, earlier in 2023, an Indian-American New Jersey-based doctor, Harsha Sani, was caught harboring 2 women here illegally from India. She forced the women, who lived in her Tinton Falls home, to work 15-hour days 7 days a week. Like many undocumented immigrants, they fear law enforcement, and Dr. Sani led them to believe they would be arrested and deported if they spoke with law enforcement about their working conditions. In addition, Dr. Sani would not allow one woman to receive treatment for a brain aneurysm until she first found someone to cover her work at the doctor's home. This case shed more light on an already illuminated problem. Number 3 is probably the least shocking on this list, other than that it's not number 1, and that is Texas. Its shared border with Mexico is over 1,200 miles, and of the state's 30 million residents, 6.77% is undocumented immigrants. Texas, despite not being number 1 on this list, has been ground zero for the migrant crisis. For years, small Texas towns have had to absorb the bulk of those who crossed the southern border illegally. For years, their resources have been depleted while politicians and lay people have hurled out accusations of racism, which is ironic since many of the people opposing these illegal border crossings are of Latin American heritage. Finally, there came a boiling point, and the governor of Texas, with help from another state on this list, began sending migrants north to sanctuary cities. While many people criticized the governor for using humans as political pawns, for many other people, their eyes were opened to the crisis that, prior to now, has largely been a Texas problem. As Chicago and New York beg for federal funding to handle the influx of migrants, many in South Texas are relieved that these cities can finally see what they've been dealing with. No matter your opinion on the situation, it is no longer just a Texas problem, and the country will have to grapple with this issue in upcoming presidential elections. Number 2 is Nevada. Though not a border state, 7.4% of its 3 million people are undocumented immigrants. This one isn't as obvious. It has only 2 sanctuary jurisdictions, and it doesn't share an international border, but it is close to the southern border. An estimated 62% come from Mexico, but the second highest is not from this hemisphere. About 10% of its undocumented immigrants come from the Philippines. In 2021, Las Vegas police came under fire for its shifting policies on migrants. Police in Las Vegas have helped federal officials capture undocumented immigrants jailed for nonviolent crimes, a shift in practice that critics say was never made public. While many people were outraged, saying that a nonviolent crime should not lead to deportation, many people supported this policy, claiming that they should not be here in the first place, so if they commit a crime, no matter how small, they should be deported. This controversial policy is what separates sanctuary cities from non-sanctuary cities and is a factor in how the states shake out on this list. And before we get to number 1, let's take a look at the states with the lowest population of undocumented immigrants. That honor goes to Vermont, West Virginia, and Montana, who all have less than 0.5% of their populations being undocumented immigrants. This isn't too big of a surprise given their small populations and distance from the southern border. They are also states that don't have as many job opportunities or big cities to find people who share their culture. And number 1 is no doubt California. California has the highest population of any state at just under 40 million, with 7.65% of its population being undocumented. That amounts to nearly 3 million people. That is more than the 17 states with the smallest populations. That is the size of 2 Hawaiis, the same amount of people as 3 Delawares. It's hard for many people to wrap their minds around that number, and yet for Californians, it's been the norm for as long as the state has been part of America. The vast majority of its undocumented immigrants are Latino, with 61% being from Mexico, 7% from El Salvador, and 6% being from Guatemala. They also have 6% of their undocumented immigrants being from the Philippines. It's no shocker why people would choose California. It's on the border, it has a high population of Spanish speakers for those coming from Latin America who want to ease in, there is plenty of seasonal labor, and the climate of Southern California is perfect year-round. California also has over 16 jurisdictions that declared themselves to be sanctuary cities. California has come under fire in the past few years for its lax policy on deportation. Many undocumented immigrants who committed violent crimes were not deported and went on to murder, rape, or even assault other people. This has caused political turmoil within the state and in the rest of the country, as many people fear all undocumented immigrants for concerns that they could be criminals, whereas others fight for those here illegally to be protected from deportation. Without this protection, they will be less likely to report a crime, even if it is committed against themselves.